I'm here today to talk to you about writing great getting started documentation. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Tim. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I live in London, in the rainy United Kingdom. I'm engaged to Alice and getting married in 5 weeks, which, as you can tell from this slide, I'm very, very excited about. And I'm a software engineer at a fintech startup called GoCardless. Here's all the team together a couple of weeks ago where we had a kind of away day. And as well as being a software engineer, I'm also a documentarian. One of the things that I was most excited about coming here last year to write the docs here in Prague was that realisation that documentarians come from all kinds of backgrounds and have all kinds of job titles, and I'm one of them. To give some context, I want to tell you a bit about what GoCardless is about, since that's kind of going to be the context and the basis of what I'm talking about today. What we're doing at GoCardless is building an API-driven bank-to-bank payments network for the internet. What does that mean? Well, we're all familiar with the big credit and debit card networks, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and a few other little ones as well. Alongside those, there are kind of alternative bank-to-bank payment networks as well. The credit card system has a lot of intermediaries, all of whom take a cut, whereas these bank-to-bank payment systems are kind of more direct, pulling money direct from one account and putting it into another. These systems are country-specific, so we have one called Direct Debit in the UK, Outer Euro in Sweden, or SEPA Direct Debit in the EU, and I believe from a bit of research that the one in the Czech Republic is called Inkasso. These systems are usually cheaper than cards, and they reduce churn for businesses using them, since bank accounts don't expire in the way that credit and debit cards do. Our goal at GoCardless is to kind of bridge together these individual national networks and provide an API that lets you use all of them with one integration. So you've got a global solution for these bank-to-bank payments. At the core of our business is our API. APIs are defined ways, documented ways for computers to talk to other computers. It's a kind of interface, a language for telling us that I want to collect a payment for this amount from this person on this day. It requires documentation because every API is different. You need to know how to use this specific one, what you should say, and what you should expect to hear back. Today I'm going to tell you the story of how we, at GoCardless, back last summer, revamped our API documentation. But to set the scene, let's rewind back to 2016. We in the UK were unfortunately busy voting to leave the European Union behind, having been promised an extra £350 million a week by certain politicians for our health service. While on the other side of the Atlantic, Donald Trump was busy getting himself elected, despite universal protestations that it just couldn't happen. While on the internet, the dad was the preferred meme of the moment. At GoCardless, we were feeling smug and satisfied with our API reference documentation. It listed in a kind of organised and logical way all of the functionality we expose in our API. They were automatically updated when we changed the API, comprehensive and to the point. Alongside those, we had a few blog posts for users new to the API, helping them to take their first steps, even if those blog posts were only to be found in the murky depths of our blog. But all the signs showed us that this wasn't really working. We got great feedback about this reference documentation every week, but nevertheless we still heard the same very basic questions time and time again, with people struggling to take even the most basic steps. We could be really tempted to wonder if our users are, well, a bit stupid. I mean, people told us our documentation was great all the time, and we understood it, right? We need to fight against this instinctive reaction with all we've got. We need to not assume that we're right and that our users are wrong or stupid. Our role as documentarians is to be advocates for our users, to help them where they want to help them to get to where they want to go. We need to take responsibility. Instead of blaming the user, we should ask questions of ourselves. We should ask ourselves, why are they struggling? How could we serve them better? What's missing? So as a team of 4, which we formed, we began thinking about the developer onboarding experience on the GoCardless platform and how we can make it better, kicking off a project to revamp the developer onboarding process and our documentation. If we're going to build better documentation, we need to start by asking the right questions, like, what is documentation for? Is it a device for troubleshooting, a way to solve specific problems? Or is it a reference for power users to refer back to when they want to do something specific or to refresh their knowledge? Or is it a minimal introduction to something new, a way to get started? Or is it a kind of sales tool in a way of inspiring people what they can do with your product, showing them the value you can provide to them? The reality is that it can be all of the above. Documentation doesn't just have one job. It has many and various. Before we start planning, let alone writing a piece of documentation, we need to ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve? Not just in the abstract, but for this specific piece of writing. What is this documentation for? What am I trying to achieve with this piece of writing? We can break that down into a series of sub-questions. The first is to ask ourselves who we're writing for. Who is my audience? We can think of this, as many of us here will be aware of, as kind of personas or use cases. But if you're on use documentation as I was, that's a kind of revolutionary idea in some ways. We should be asking ourselves, what does this kind of user need to know? What are they trying to achieve? What are they likely to struggle with? So for example, the needs for some brand new to go cardless and our product and our API, who's never used the product before, let alone built an API integration, those needs are very different to those of an API expert who's looking to refresh their memory or implement some new functionality. The reason I thought reference documentation was good was because it was good for me. I built the API, so I knew quite a lot about it, unsurprisingly. But when I wanted to refresh my memory about it, then that was the place where I could look to do that. Of course, we can go further and break down our kind of user groups, personas, into smaller and smaller groups, trying to segment our audience further and further with more and more specific resources for specific groups of people. So for example, we can segment a level further and say, amongst these new users, some of them will have used direct debit before and will be familiar with it, whereas others will be completely new to it and will need the basic concepts explained to them. For now, we're going to focus on the most salient, the most important split, that between the kind of new and existing users. But it's important to remember that you can continue this process kind of indefinitely and keep segmenting more and more to write more and more specific and useful documentation. As well as asking who we're writing for, we need to ask, what do we want to tell these people about? We can't possibly write everything that someone might want to know. For example, we chose to assume that our readers would know how to program, given that we're writing developer documentation. You do see some kind of API documentation that actually goes a step back from that and is written for people who are completely unexperienced with programming. Similarly, we chose to only cover the most commonly used parts of the product. We have a lot of kind of features on the margins that most people don't use. We chose to cover the most important ones in our kind of getting started documentation. It became very clear that our existing reference documentation was great if you knew roughly what you were doing, but it wasn't so good if you were brand new to the platform. In fact, it was pretty useless. It assumed way too much existing knowledge. For example, when you landed on the reference documentation, you're greeted with a sidebar on the left-hand side with sections for each of the APIs that we expose. What about if you didn't know which was the one you should start with? This would leave a new user looking something like this. It was also important to note that this form of documentation didn't bring users to what we could call the magic moment. This is an idea that comes from Alex Schultz, Facebook's VP of Growth. The magic moment is the eureka or aha moment where a user grasps for the first time the value your product can provide. This applies equally to kind of businesses like mine or open source products even. The same thing will apply everywhere. You want to show the user the value they can get. You want to make the right first impression. A user that hits this magic moment is likely to stay a customer for a long time. They're likely to have a higher lifetime value. They're likely to be profitable for your business. They're the things that you're looking for. We want to get them to this kind of lift-off point as quickly as possible. This means helping the user to make progress quickly, see very soon what you can help them achieve, and indeed see how you can change their world. In the case of the product I'm working with, changing their world means changing how they collect payments, but if that's your job on a day-to-day, that's quite a big deal if you can make that even 20% better. It was clear that we needed getting started documentation to take people through the initial steps, filling in the assumptions that this reference documentation made, and leaving them feeling comfortable with roughly how this works. It's important that we note here there wasn't anything wrong with the reference documentation. This kind of documentation just fulfills a very different use case of the user who's already familiar, but wants to refresh their memory. In the reference docs, they can see the exact parameters a particular request takes, precisely what the response looks like, how a particular complicated feature works, but that's not useful for a new user. We could be tempted to try to work on the margins, add a little bit to this documentation, make it better for the new people. For example, adding a start here section or improving how we explain concepts. And this would work to an extent. But we need to go back to the original questions. We need to acknowledge that there are two completely different personas here. We don't want to combine them and, in the process, give both a kind of 6 out of 10 experience. It's much better to target specific kinds of users and create a tailored and great experience for each kind. Even the very best reference material is not a substitute for a good guide. We went down that route. We added lots of code samples to our reference documentation, but we still found that it didn't solve the problem that we really wanted to solve. There's been a trend, and in many ways a good one in the world of APIs that many of us will be familiar with, towards describing APIs using structured formats called schemas, and using these to automatically build documentation. Now this is great. It means that your documentation is never out of date. It means that it's complete. These are really great things for reference documentation. But we need to accept that this isn't enough. Writing great documentation takes work. We should stick by our automatically generated reference documentation. It can be useful, but it serves one, not all use cases. It's a start, but for those building and documenting APIs like me, we have to take a step away from this dream of automating all the process away and making things automatic, and accept that if we want our users to be really satisfied to reach a magic moment, to understand our product, we need to be ready to write for them. Let's dig a little bit deeper now into what's special about this getting started documentation as a medium, and how we can make it great. As a small team of 4, we started taking a look at other API companies, looking at examples of this getting started documentation done right. We started with Stripe, a natural match for us given their focus on building an API-led card payments platform, which is very similar to what we're doing in some ways. We were super impressed with their long-form content, the way that they made the content shine through with a kind of simple but effective design, the way they laid out the options a user could choose from, the way they embedded code samples into their work. We also took a look at Clearbit, a business intelligence provider. They provide services like you put in an email and they return the person's name, where they work, that kind of thing. They did a great job of integrating their getting started experience with their dashboard, appearing as soon as you finish signing up. During the sign-up process, they ask you which of their products you want to use and what language you're working in. And then, once you finish signing up, they take you straight to where you need to be. They give you code samples in the language you wanted them in, even with your API key, which is a bit like a password for the API embedded in. So you can literally copy and paste these examples, and they're ready to go. Finally, we took a look at Twilio, a telephony provider. They ask you during sign up what product you want to use, and then take you to an appropriate getting started page. That page not only guides you through the kind of technical integration steps, but also the things that you kind of need to do within the product. So for example, setting up your first phone number. They also do a really great job in their long-form documentation explaining the concepts behind Twilio. We work with our sales and developer support teams as well internally, who spend all their time talking directly with customers. This is really important. It can be easy for us to think as documentarians that we know everything, we know what we should write, we know the things that people are going to care about. But we want to make sure that we use the resources at our disposal. We listen to the people in our businesses or who we know who work directly with customers. Both teams flagged up demand for code samples in our documentation, so that led us in our initial forays into writing new stuff. They were also able to link us up with users who were currently integrated with the API, or were about to start. We wanted to understand the experience from their perspective, since they're the kind of use case that we're trying to cater to. We wanted to know where they made mistakes, what they wish they'd known in the beginning, what things weren't clear to them. With just a month or so's work end to end, we built our new developer site. It incorporated the existing API reference that I've been talking about, with a brand new getting started guide, and all this within a new redesign that was targeted at readability and letting the content itself shine through as much as possible. We came to the conclusion that what we needed was a more linear introduction to the API, offering a kind of thought-through, ordered way of thinking about things, with as few assumptions as possible, ideal for the new user. We couldn't just merge this into what we already had, as they're just fundamentally very different types of content. The kind of reference is designed to be dipped into, you don't read it from top to bottom, whereas the guide is designed to be designed to be read kind of from the start to the end, and to be followed quite linearly. We found that 3 things were much easier with this linear structure, which made the experience much better for new users. It was much easier to introduce concepts. It was much easier to handhold the user through their initial steps, and it was much easier to convey best practices. I'll talk about these benefits from the point of view of documenting APIs, but I think they're quite generally applicable elsewhere as well. Firstly, introducing concepts. Products that we're documenting inevitably involve certain important ideas or things you're talking about, things you're working with. The user needs to understand these concepts and how they can fit together before they can use your product successfully. Often these things will align with concepts the users will be familiar with. So for example, the idea of a payment isn't a confusing or controversial one. It's an amount of money taken from a customer's bank account on a particular day for a particular amount with some metadata like a description that the merchant can see and a reference that will appear on the customer's bank statement. Other concepts are less clear and require a lot more explanation. One of the most central concepts in GoCardless's world is the mandate. A mandate is authorization to pull money from a customer's bank account. This isn't something that you know about intuitively, you might not have come across it before, so we needed to take particular care to explain that. With that missing, if you didn't know about that, the entire thing made no sense, you didn't really know what it was. And that was one of the things that people struggled with the original reference documentation. Introducing the key concepts is really important to a user's understanding of your product. They work well in a linear structure because they make sense to introduce in a particular order, probably gradually, so they're much easier to convey in this kind of structure. Secondly, we found that the linear structure was better for kind of hand-holding through the first steps with our product. As far as possible, we wanted our user to feel kind of safe and guided through. We wanted them to know what they should do and in what order. We wanted to show them the things that were most useful and most powerful, that they're most likely to find useful, and to help them reach the magic moment as quickly as possible. In this more linear kind of documentation, we can do that. We can have a kind of ordered step-by-step approach, showing the user what to do and explaining the options to them as we go. To plan our writing, we thought about the key flows in our API and used those to inform the structure of the guide. As far as possible, we try to show the user exactly what to do. With code samples, they can copy and paste, so they can get moving as quickly as possible. For us, these flows were kind of getting your kind of the foundations of your integration set up, then setting up your customer, then taking payments, and then being able to listen to what happens to those payments. So for example, to be able to take action and send an email if a payment fails. We thought about these core flows and then made sure they were well represented and done in the right order in this guide. We want to get the user moving as quickly as possible. And since there's a linear progression, each section of the guide ends with a summary of what you've just done and what's going to happen next, with a link to the next part. There's a sense of flow, a sense of momentum, a sense of purpose in what you're doing. We tell you in the introduction where you're going to get to as well, what you're going to have done by the end of this guide. And at the end of the guide, the user's in a position where they have a good foundational understanding of what they can do. And from then on, they have the assumptions filled in so they can use the reference documentation to look into more advanced features or do new things. And not only that, but having followed the code samples through, they've got a basic API integration that they can then customize to their own needs and work on top of. Thirdly, we found that the linear structure was better for encouraging best practices, particularly in terms of reliability and security. We knew all too well from our own experiences that when people mess this up, as they inevitably did fairly frequently, it actually ended up creating a lot of pain for us, not just for them. So for example, there have been many instances where people have accidentally double charged their customers due to problems with their integrations. There are certain things you can do when you're building to prevent that from happening. We wanted to convey that. We found that this was quite hard to do in the reference documentation. That's because many of these best practices are at a kind of meta level. That means you probably you can't really put them into kind of individual resource sections of the API. You either end up putting them at the top or at the bottom. Inevitably, this means that people don't read them because they look for a specific thing and don't see this. We don't want these things to be glossed over because they're really important to having a successful integration. In our linear getting started guide, we can call out these best practices at exactly the right point in the flow where they make sense, using appropriate UI elements to highlight the information. Even better, we can use code examples which show by example what the user should do. Here, for example, we use a feature called idempotency keys, which prevent people double charging their customers. By integrating this into our code samples, users can learn by example. They can learn how to build things the right way. Similarly, we have a feature called pre-filled customers. Basically what this does is allows you to fill in your customers' details that you already have on our payment pages, so they don't have to type them themselves. That improves conversion and creates a better experience. By including this in our examples, we kind of set the expectation this is what you should do, and it means that people are more likely to do the right thing and build a great experience. So we've heard about what the linear structure is great for. It's great for explaining concepts, it's great for hand-holding, and it's great for kind of conveying best practices. What did we learn on the way while we were building this? Firstly, we've talked about the importance of personas and use cases. To write good documentation, we need to understand our user and what they need. The meaningful differences between different readers mean that we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to reviewing and testing our documentation, the same way that we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to writing it. We can't hope, for example, as developers who've built an API or people who know about the company very well, to be able to review it effectively. We can't accurately, as experts, measure the effectiveness of a piece of documentation written for novices. We can get a ton of experience and expertise from resources we can find online, like the Write the Docs Beginner's Guide to Writing Documentation, or from colleagues and friends. But this is no substitute for actually testing on real-world beginners. As I mentioned earlier, before we started writing, we chatted to people who had recently built API integrations and tried to understand what they struggled with. We used their feedback to inform what we started writing. But having written our first drafts and worked together to write those, there was no substitute for putting that in front of real new users, people who'd never seen the API before, and seeing how they performed. So we brought some developers into the office that we knew who'd never used the API before, sat them down with a cup of tea, and got them to go through what we'd written, and noting down their thoughts as they went, kind of a stream of consciousness on paper so that we could understand what things they didn't understand, what things they were confused by. We learned that we hadn't been clear enough still in explaining the concepts underlying direct debit and how they hold together. This led us to revisit what we'd written, to kind of double down on trying to make it as clear as possible. Inevitably as well, we found we'd made a bunch of kind of micro-level mistakes in terms of, for example, broken links or errors in our code samples or spelling mistakes. We corrected these and implemented processes to try to stop us from making these mistakes again. So, for example, as part of our kind of automated deployment flow, we check for broken links, we check our code samples so that things don't get deployed that are broken. Obviously, we can do these checks manually as well, but it's much better if you can automate it so you can not accidentally miss things. Naturally, we thanked our testers for all their time and hard work with our ever-famous Go Carver swag, which I'm featuring now, and other wonderful gifts, namely beer. Secondly, documentation which people don't find doesn't make an impact. As well as thinking about the who and the what of documentation, we also need to think about the where. We want our documentation to be as proximate to our users as possible. Outside of our reference docs, as I mentioned earlier, we had a kind of bunch of blog posts and support centre articles which helped people to do things, but these were too hard to track down. Being particularly impressed by examples like Clearbit that we saw earlier, we wanted to take our users straight to our documentation from the product to make it a kind of integral part of the experience. This started with some drawn-out mock-ups by me. As you can tell, I'm an engineer and not a designer. But it was turned into something quite beautiful, an experience integrated natively into our dashboard, where the user identifies themselves when they first sign up as an API integrator. And then we can show them step by step what they need to do. We get a nice UI showing you what you should do to get started. When you click on the steps, you get taken to the right place, whether that's kind of somewhere in the dashboard itself, or a piece of documentation you should read through and follow. So for example, when we click the highlighted step, create an access token, we get taken through to the relevant screen to do that. Having finished, we're then prompted to go to the next step. The next thing we need to do is add our first customer. So we do that via the API, and then sometime later we go back to the dashboard, and we find that as we've gone, these steps have been ticked off. This gives a real sense of feedback, gives a sense of momentum to the user, and helps them to see that they're making progress, they're learning something, and it shows them what they've got to do next as well. This makes for docs that are not only useful, but also ones the user can actually find. If they can't find them, they're not useful. Thirdly, we learn to simplify aggressively. As I mentioned earlier, we have to make a decision about the scope of our documentation. It's quite easy to go over the top and to try to say everything that someone could possibly want to know. But there's a real dead weight loss when we do this. The more that we add that's not useful, we just make our guides kind of more complicated and hard to read. The user loses their sense of momentum. They need to be able to trust us and to know that we're telling them the things that really matter, that there's nothing that's unnecessary. We should cut anything that doesn't bring the user to the magic moment, that doesn't give them a sense of aha or eureka, that doesn't show them how they're doing. Let me introduce you to an example of that for us. There are two ways to set up a customer in GoCardless. You can either use our hosted payment pages, or you can build our own. The former is by far the most common path. It avoids a ton of work, it saves worrying about compliance, and it provides a great experience for your customer from the start. Whilst there are other ways you can do this, we kind of highlighted this as the option you should do. We aggressively simplified by only including this most common path in the Getting Started guide. We tell the user they can build their own if they like, and tell them where to look to find out how to do that, but we don't clutter the guide by kind of branching off into different ways of working or different approaches. We just show the thing that matters most. Naturally, there's a value judgment to be made here. Sometimes it will be important to include these options, because they're equally important or because the user really needs to see both to know what's right for them. For example, in our platform, there are two ways of setting up payments. You can either set them up kind of individually ad hoc, or you can set up a recurring subscription that automatically takes payments once a month or something like that. These are both kind of equally common and equally valid options. So we show both. We suggest the user follows through both examples, and then they can make an informed choice about what's right for them. As often as you can, ask yourself, do I need this? Does this add to my documentation? Does it bring the user to the magic moment? Once you've released the first version of your guides, you'll want to be iterating on them and keeping them up to date as you build new features into your product. There'll be calls for people in your organisation to include every little thing, to keep adding, to keep voting, basically. We need to be ready to reject this and to be ready to say no to maintain what we have, to maintain the simplicity and the sense of momentum. Before we go and grab some delicious lunch, I'm going to give a quick recap of what we've learned today. Firstly, we want to focus on what users' needs. We need to understand their use cases and use that to inform what we write. For example, differentiating between the needs of new users and existing users. On one hand, this means not neglecting our reference documentation. It's hugely valuable and isn't something we can afford to neglect, whether we're building an API or something else. But we also need to acknowledge that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. As documentarians, we'd rather spend more time building great tailored experiences rather than something that doesn't really meet anyone's needs. This just means realistically having different pieces of documentation for different people. Finally, for brand new users, getting started documentation is key. It will naturally have a more linear structure than as a guide, and we should make the most of this structure and what it allows by kind of explaining concepts, hand-holding, and encouraging best practices. We can get the most value from our Getting Started documentation by integrating with our product, simplifying aggressively, and making sure that we test what we built with real beginners. I'd be remiss if I didn't give a quick plug for GoCardless before I finish. We're hiring in London for all kinds of jobs, whether that's engineers or writers, all kinds of stuff. I've had a great experience there, and I'd encourage, if you're interested, to talk to me. I'd love to tell you about it. Thanks so much for your time today. I hope this talk has been interesting and useful. I'd love to hear what you think, and I'll be around for some questions. Or you can tweet me. I am Tim Rogers. Thank you.